Picture this. A young Japanese soldier, barely out of his teenage years, sits quietly on the edge of a wooden bunk in an American camp. In his hands, steam curls up from a bowl of hot soup. Across from him, a guard sets down a slice of bread, soft and warm. The soldier stares in disbelief. Is this a prison? He had been trained to expect pain, humiliation, and death. Yet here he was, wrapped in a blanket, fed like a guest rather than chained like a beast. He whispered to himself a question that echoed in the minds of thousands of others. Why am I treated like a human here, when my own commanders left me to starve? It is a paradox that reverberates across history. The same young men who had sworn never to be captured, who had been told that surrender was worse than death, would later describe American prison camps as places where for the first time they could feel human. Isn't that astonishing? Doesn't it force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the brutal logic of World War II? What do you think? Could a prison truly feel like freedom? To understand this contradiction, we must step back to the early 1940s. Japan had become a nation consumed by war, a society where individual lives were expendable in the service of empire. Boys were drafted at 18, sometimes younger, and drilled to believe that to be captured was the ultimate disgrace. In training grounds, instructors barked questions. Would you choose the enemy's rope or your own blade? And the answer was always the same, the blade. Death before dishonor. It was not just a slogan, it was a creed engraved into their bones. Now contrast that with America. On the other side of the Pacific, military tradition and international law emphasized that prisoners, once disarmed, were to be treated according to principles that went beyond strategy. To many Americans, it was not simply about rules on paper, but about the nation's identity. How you treated the enemy said as much about you as it did about them. This is a profound difference, isn't it? While Japanese soldiers expected torture, American guards handed out bread and blankets. So which system truly commanded loyalty and which one eroded it? Imagine the shock. For a soldier accustomed to eating little more than a bowl of rice mixed with barley husks, suddenly being given meat, vegetables, or even a taste of fruit. For men who had marched barefoot through mud with open sores, suddenly a medic appeared, cleaning wounds, offering medicine. Many could not trust their eyes. Some believed it was a trick. Some thought the food must be poisoned. Others refused the cigarettes offered to them, convinced that kindness was a weapon. But slowly, as days turned into weeks, the suspicion gave way to bewilderment, and bewilderment to reflection. Why would the enemy treat them better than their own superiors ever had? That question became the beginning of transformation. And I want to ask you, listening now, what would you feel if the person who once tried to kill you now carried you on a stretcher to safety? Would you cling to hate, or would something inside you begin to shift? The Japan of those years was a nation hollowed out by total war. Families rationed every grain, fuel was saved for battleships, and medicine was so scarce that even wounded veterans returned home with little more than cloth bandages. In some villages, mothers mixed sawdust or tree bark into rice to stretch the rations. Children's bellies swelled not from abundance but from malnutrition. Against that backdrop, the American camps seemed surreal. Beds with sheets, soup with actual meat, doctors who cared about toothaches, guards who asked for your name. Can you imagine how disorienting it must have felt? Yet there is a darker mirror. While Japanese prisoners in American hands discovered comfort, Allied prisoners in Japanese camps endured starvation, beatings, and forced labor. One side turned captivity into a lesson in human dignity, the other turned it into a sentence of slow death. How could two warring nations see the same situation in such opposite ways? Was it cultural? Strategic? Or did it reflect something deeper about how each side defined humanity itself? The paradox is that kindness proved powerful. Prisoners who had been indoctrinated to resist interrogation now found themselves talking freely, not because they were broken, but because they felt obliged to reciprocate decency. An enemy who fed you, clothed you, and treated you with respect was no longer simply the enemy. He was a man. And when men see each other as men, words begin to flow. Secrets slip out. Intelligence is gathered not through whips but through warmth. Isn't that remarkable? Isn't that a lesson worth remembering today? Think for a moment of the sensory world these young Japanese soldiers encountered. The smell of coffee drifting from a camp kitchen. The crack of a baseball bat as American guards played in the yard. The flickering light of a projector as prisoners were shown films, their first glimpse of Hollywood's bright dreamscapes. All of it stood in stark contrast to the mud, hunger, and despair of the battlefront. For some, the camp became a strange place of education. English classes, workshops, even religious freedom, things denied in the army suddenly appeared here in captivity. What kind of prison was this, they wondered, where one could learn carpentry instead of digging graves? But not every man embraced it. Shame hung heavy. For many, surrender remained a stigma that no kindness could erase. Some bowed their heads in silence, refusing food, convinced that death was the only honorable path. Others accepted the bread but wept as they wrote letters home, fearing their families would reject them. "I am alive," some wrote, "but perhaps it would have been better if I had died honorably." Can you feel the weight of that conflict? The clash between a lifetime of indoctrination and the undeniable reality of compassion? Over time, the reports filtered back to Japanese command. Letters intercepted, rumors whispered by men returning home, fragments of truth that contradicted official propaganda. And the leadership in Tokyo feared this truth more than bullets. If soldiers believed capture might mean survival, even dignity, would they still fight to the last? This was the dangerous question, the crack in the armor of fanatic resistance. The very humanity shown in those camps became, unintentionally, a weapon of war. So let us pause and reflect. In the cauldron of the Pacific War, where cruelty was commonplace, where entire cities burned and where millions perished, there existed these unlikely sanctuaries. Places where the enemy's sun could be warmed by soup, healed by medicine, and perhaps, just perhaps, rediscover his own worth as a human being. Doesn't that force us to rethink what victory truly means? Is it measured by the ground you conquer, or by the humanity you preserve? And as you listen, ask yourself, if you had been in the shoes of that young soldier, spoon in hand, staring at bread and soup in a place you thought would be hell, what would you have felt? Relief? Confusion? Gratitude? Or something far more complicated? I'd love to know what you think. Share your thoughts, because history is not just about facts, it is about how we, today, interpret the choices of yesterday. The journey of these prisoners was not a single moment of shock, but a series of revelations, each one shaking the foundations of what they believed about the world. Imagine walking into a camp infirmary. The smell of disinfectant, the clink of metal instruments. A doctor leans over, his face tired but intent, examining a wound that had been festering for days. The soldier expects indifference, perhaps a sneer. Instead, the doctor says softly, "We'll fix this," and begins to clean and stitch the injury with care. For many Japanese captives, it was the first time in their lives that anyone had treated their pain as worthy of attention. Isn't it ironic? On the battlefield they were told they were expendable. In captivity they were reminded they were human. These moments carried more weight than any speech or declaration. They planted seeds of doubt. If the enemy showed compassion, then perhaps the world was not as simple as the slogans had claimed. Perhaps loyalty to the emperor was not the only path to honor. Perhaps surrender did not mean shame, but survival with dignity. And yet, such thoughts were dangerous, even within the quiet walls of a camp. Prisoners often whispered among themselves, torn between gratitude and fear of betraying the ideals they had been raised on. Can you imagine that inner struggle? To accept kindness was to risk betraying your own identity. To refuse it was to deny your own survival. Food became one of the most powerful symbols of this contradiction. In the Japanese army, rations were thin, sometimes little more than a handful of rice and pickled vegetables. Hunger was constant, gnawing, and accepted as part of duty. In American camps, however, meals were structured, hearty, and surprisingly generous. Bread, soup, sometimes even meat or fruit. A soldier might sit staring at his tray, paralyzed by suspicion. Could it be poisoned? Was this all some elaborate trick? But then he would glance at the guards, see them eating the same food, and slowly he would lift the spoon to his mouth. The warmth filled his stomach, the salt and fat exploding on his tongue, and with each bite the old certainties cracked a little more. Isn't it astonishing that something as simple as bread could become an act of psychological warfare, not through cruelty but through kindness? The camps themselves were landscapes of paradox. Wooden barracks with real beds. Blankets folded neatly at the foot of each cot. A library stocked with books, some in English, some translated. Baseball fields where prisoners could play, laughter echoing under the watchtowers. The very concept of recreation was alien to men who had spent years in an army where exhaustion and suffering were proof of loyalty. Here they were encouraged to learn, to read, to practice new skills. Some picked up carpentry, others tried painting, a few even studied English. For the first time, they were treated not as replaceable cogs in a machine, but as individuals with potential. What do you think that does to a man's sense of self? Of course, not every day was filled with comfort. There were rules, restrictions, and moments of tension. Guards remained watchful, and escape attempts, though rare, were punished. Yet even discipline felt different here. Punishment was measured, not arbitrary. Orders were barked, but not accompanied by the blows of a rifle butt. For soldiers accustomed to officers who struck them for the smallest misstep, the restraint of American guards was baffling. Respect, even in enforcement, was a revelation. And isn't respect, in its quiet way, more disarming than fear? Letters home added another layer of complexity. Prisoners were allowed to write, to reach across oceans of war and whisper to their families, "I am alive, I am cared for, I eat well." These words carried weight far beyond the camp fences. They slipped through censors, reached the ears of Japanese officials, and contradicted the propaganda that painted American prisons as places of torment. Imagine the shock in Tokyo when intercepted letters described not starvation but soup, not beatings but blankets. These testimonies threatened the very foundation of military indoctrination. If captured soldiers could survive with dignity, then the demand for death before surrender began to crumble. And I ask you, which is stronger, the power of a slogan, or the quiet truth of a handwritten letter? The psychological journey of these prisoners was profound. Many arrived expecting the worst: execution, torture, humiliation. Instead they found routine, nourishment, even kindness. Slowly their guard dropped. Some began to smile at the guards, others learned enough English to say, "Thank you." In interviews and interrogations, they spoke more freely than anyone expected. They revealed details about supply routes, about the morale of their units, about the shortages gripping their homeland. And they did so not because they were coerced, but because they felt a strange debt of gratitude. Isn't that an extraordinary irony? That treating prisoners with dignity became more effective for intelligence than any whip or threat ever could. Yet beneath the surface, shame still lingered. To be a prisoner was still to carry a scar. Some refused to talk, retreating into silence, clinging to their code. Others wrestled with guilt, torn between relief at survival and the fear of dishonoring their families. One could imagine them lying awake at night, staring at the wooden ceiling above, torn between two worlds, the world they were raised in and the world they now saw with their own eyes. Which world was real? Which one held the truth? Can you feel the weight of that question? As months passed, patterns emerged. Reports noted that Japanese prisoners often arrived malnourished, weak, and filled with dread, yet after weeks in American custody they gained weight, their color returned, and their spirits lifted. Photographs taken during those months show faces softening, expressions lightening, men who looked more like students than soldiers. In the middle of a global war, the camps became small islands of unexpected humanity. And that raises a haunting thought. If even enemies could find common ground here, what does it say about the larger conflict raging outside the fences? The contrast with Japanese-run camps remained stark. Allied prisoners in Asia suffered unimaginable conditions: starvation, disease, brutal labor. Mortality rates soared. And so the paradox deepened. On one side, a prison could become a place of survival, even growth. On the other, it became a death sentence. How could the same word, prison, mean such different realities? What do you think this contrast reveals about the values of each side? Was it mere circumstance, or a reflection of something deeper in the cultural fabric of the nations at war? The story of these Japanese prisoners is not simply about comfort in captivity. It is about transformation. It is about young men raised to believe their worth was tied only to sacrifice, discovering that they had value as individuals. Guards who learned their names, doctors who cared for their pain, administrators who allowed them to study or write letters. These small acts added up to something revolutionary. And when those men returned home after the war, carrying memories of kindness from the enemy, they carried seeds of change. Seeds that would one day influence not just their own lives but the society they rejoined. So here is the question I leave you with at this stage. What is the true measure of power? Is it the ability to destroy or the ability to preserve? Is it found in fear or in dignity? The American camps seem to suggest that power was not only about weapons, but about the courage to treat even an enemy with humanity. And that lesson, perhaps, is one of the most enduring legacies of the war. The rhythm of life inside the camps grew familiar. Dawn broke with the sound of boots on gravel, a roll call conducted not with shouts and strikes but with orderly precision. Prisoners lined up, received breakfast, and began their day. But unlike the drills of the Japanese army where exhaustion was glorified, here the schedule balanced discipline with care. After meals, some were assigned light work, gardening, repairing equipment, assisting in kitchens. Others attended classes where they learned English phrases, basic arithmetic, or even music. For men who had been trained only for war, this was bewildering. Education in captivity? Could such a thing even be real? One former soldier recalled the first time he held a book in his hands, not a manual of tactics or a volume of slogans, but a novel. The pages smelled of ink and paper. The words carried him to places beyond the battlefield. It was as though, for the first time, he had permission to think about life beyond duty. Isn't that remarkable? That in the very heart of war, a prison camp could become a classroom of the mind? Sports added another layer to the paradox. Baseball, a game already known in Japan, became a bridge between captors and captives. Guards pitched, prisoners swung, laughter rippled across the field. For a few hours, the lines between enemy and enemy blurred. Men who might have killed each other weeks earlier now cheered each other's runs. Isn't it strange how something as simple as a bat and ball could challenge the deep divisions of war? What do you think? Can play be more subversive than propaganda? Recreation extended beyond games. In some camps, prisoners organized theatrical performances, donning makeshift costumes, staging plays that mixed humor with longing. Others sang songs from home, their voices carrying into the night air, reminding them that they were still part of something larger than the war. These moments of creativity softened the harshness of captivity, turning prison into a place where imagination could breathe. It was not freedom, but it was not despair either. It was something in between, something that allowed men to hold on to fragments of their humanity. The physical environment reinforced this sense of paradox. The barracks, while simple, were orderly and relatively comfortable. Beds with sheets, stoves for heating, latrines kept clean. For soldiers who had slept in foxholes, soaked by rain, eaten by insects, this was almost luxurious. One prisoner marveled at the idea of personal space. A bed that was his, a blanket that belonged only to him. In the Japanese army, even such simple possessions had been denied. Everything belonged to the emperor, the unit, the war. But here, in captivity, they were granted individuality. Isn't it ironic that imprisonment taught them what ownership felt like? Perhaps the most astonishing revelation came through medical care. Not only were wounds treated, but routine checkups were provided. Teeth were pulled or repaired, eyes examined, even spectacles issued to those with poor vision. Imagine the shock of a man who had squinted his entire life suddenly handed a pair of glasses by an American doctor who said, "No man should live in darkness if it can be helped." What did that mean for a soldier taught that his worth was measured only by his capacity to obey and die? Can you see how such small gestures became revolutionary? These experiences created a subtle but profound shift. In interrogations, officers noted that Japanese prisoners often spoke with unexpected openness. They offered details, sometimes eagerly, not because they were beaten or threatened, but because they felt indebted. To be treated as a man rather than as an expendable tool inspired loyalty of a different kind. And this loyalty, ironically, flowed not to their emperor but to the strangers who had shown them dignity. Doesn't that challenge everything we assume about the nature of war? Still, not every man accepted this new reality. Shame not at many. Some refused to participate in activities, isolating themselves in silence. They feared that enjoying comfort in captivity was a betrayal, that laughter on a baseball field dishonored the fallen. The weight of culture pressed heavily on their shoulders. They were torn between the indoctrination of their youth and the undeniable evidence before their eyes. Imagine the nights they lay awake, torn between guilt and gratitude, asking themselves, "Who am I if surrender has given me life? Who am I if the enemy treats me as more human than my own leaders ever did?" Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese-run camps told a different story. Allied prisoners there endured harsh labor, starvation diets, untreated diseases. Mortality rates climbed as men wasted away. Letters, when they could be smuggled, spoke of despair, not dignity. The contrast was so stark that American officials realized it could be leveraged as a weapon of morale. By demonstrating humane treatment, they not only extracted intelligence but also undermined the will of enemy forces. Kindness, in this sense, became a strategic asset. But ask yourself, was it strategy alone, or was it also a reflection of who Americans believed they were? And if it was both, doesn't that complicate the way we think about morality in war? As 1944 turned into 1945, more Japanese soldiers fell into American custody. Word spread slowly but surely that capture did not mean death. Soldiers whispered among themselves before battles, "If I am taken, perhaps I will live." It was a thought that would have been unthinkable only years before. Some began to surrender in small numbers, often after being wounded. They signaled their willingness to be taken, laid down their weapons and braced for brutality. Instead, they found bandages and bread. The shock of survival cracked the once absolute wall of resistance. Isn't that extraordinary, that the simple act of keeping a promise of humane treatment could erode the most fanatical commitment to fight to the last? The ripple effects reached beyond the battlefield. Families in Japan, hearing rumors of decent treatment, clung to hope that their sons might still be alive. Letters intercepted by censors carried unsettling truths, that American prisons were not hell but havens. Officials struggled to suppress this information, but whispers traveled faster than decrees. The propaganda machine strained to insist that surrender meant dishonor, but each returned prisoner, each smuggled letter, each rumor contradicted the message. And I want to ask you, what is stronger in the long run, propaganda or lived experience? Which would you trust if you were a young soldier on the edge of collapse? The paradox continued to deepen. The camps, intended as places of confinement, became laboratories of transformation. Men who entered broken and terrified emerged healthier, more educated, and strangely more reflective. They began to question not only the war but the very culture that had raised them. Some even began to dream about life after captivity, returning home, using their new skills, sharing what they had learned. The idea that captivity could become a stepping stone toward renewal was astonishing. Could it be that the greatest weapon America wielded was not its bombs or bullets, but its insistence on treating even enemies with dignity? In the quiet moments of camp life, when a prisoner sat on his bunk, pencil in hand, writing to his mother that he was alive and well, the world of war shifted ever so slightly. Each letter was a crack in the wall of fear. Each healed wound was a testimony that compassion could coexist with conflict. And each meal, each shared smile, each game of baseball whispered the same radical truth. Even in war, humanity could prevail. As the war dragged on, the psychological impact of these experiences grew more pronounced. Many Japanese prisoners began to see their captivity not simply as survival, but as a strange kind of rebirth. For the first time, they could pause and reflect on their own lives without the constant weight of military command pressing down. They began to notice details they had once ignored: the color of autumn leaves in an American camp, the taste of butter spread across bread, the laughter of guards telling jokes in a language they barely understood. These details, so ordinary to their captors, were extraordinary to men who had been denied all sense of individuality. Can you imagine the emotional whiplash of realizing that even as a prisoner, you were living better than you had as a soldier? The most startling transformation came through recognition. Guards who learned their names, doctors who asked about their families, administrators who allowed them to choose a skill to learn. These acts told prisoners that they were not faceless enemies but human beings. For soldiers raised in a culture that suppressed individuality, this was profoundly unsettling. They had been told their only worth was in obedience and sacrifice. Now they were told, through action rather than words, that their worth lay simply in being alive. Isn't that a radical shift? Doesn't it challenge the very foundation of the society that sent them to war? Some prisoners began to write openly in their diaries, recording not just the routines of camp life but the thoughts they had long buried. They reflected on their childhoods, on the poverty of their villages, on the rigidity of their training. For the first time they felt safe enough to ask questions. Why had they been taught to die rather than live? Why had they been denied basic comforts that even their enemies considered normal? These private writings, many of which surfaced after the war, reveal a depth of introspection that might never have been possible without the paradox of humane captivity. What do you think? Does reflection require freedom, or can it bloom even in confinement if dignity is preserved? The American approach also revealed a strategic brilliance that went beyond compassion. By treating prisoners well, the military created willing informants without coercion. The information gathered proved invaluable. Locations of supply depots, morale conditions within Japanese units, even insights into command structures. But perhaps more importantly, the humane treatment itself became a weapon of influence. As word spread, the rigid determination of Japanese troops to fight to the last man softened, if only slightly. Each soldier who laid down his weapon rather than die was a testament to the power of kindness as strategy. Doesn't this force us to rethink what victory means? Can it be achieved not only by force, but by the moral authority of humane conduct? For prisoners, this realization was both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, they felt a gratitude that sometimes bordered on awe. On the other, they feared what would happen when they returned home. Would their families see them as survivors or as cowards? Would they be welcomed or shunned? The weight of cultural shame was heavy, and many kept their experiences hidden for decades after the war. Yet, inside the camp, those fears were tempered by the daily rhythm of respect and care. Even as they carried the stigma of surrender, they also carried the memory of dignity restored. That contradiction lived within them, unresolved but powerful. In the broader scope of history, these camps became more than just holding places. They became mirrors that reflected the values of each nation involved in the conflict. On one side, brutality and neglect defined captivity. On the other, a commitment to international law and a belief in human dignity shaped it. Which image endured longer? Which left deeper scars? These are not easy questions, but they are essential ones. And I ask you, in our own time when conflicts still rage, which example would you want your nation to follow? As 1945 approached, the inevitability of Japan's defeat loomed. 4 prisoners already in American camps, this reality created new layers of thought. Some began to imagine what a post-war Japan might look like. Having seen education, religious freedom, and respect for individuality within their prison walls, they wondered whether their homeland could ever embrace such ideals. Others resisted these thoughts, clinging fiercely to the belief that their duty remained unchanged, even if their circumstances had shifted. The camps became quiet laboratories of ideology, where old beliefs wrestled with new experiences, and where each man's soul became a battlefield of its own. Perhaps the most powerful testimony to the transformative power of these camps lies in the stories of repatriated prisoners after the war. Some returned to Japan and carried with them seeds of change. They spoke cautiously at first, sharing memories of bread, medicine, and books. For families who had suffered hunger and deprivation, these stories were difficult to accept. Could it really be true that the enemy treated their sons better than their own nation had? The answer, whispered in kitchens and remembered in private diaries, was yes. And that truth slowly chipped away at the unquestioned authority of the old order. But let us not romanticize too much. Not all prisoners embraced the paradox. Some never forgave themselves for surrender. Some carried the shame like an invisible chain until their dying days. For them, the kindness of captivity was not liberation, but a cruel reminder of what they had lost, the honor they believed could only be preserved in death. These men lived in a prison far deeper than any camp fence, the prison of their own minds. Doesn't that remind us that even kindness cannot always undo the grip of culture? Still, the broader legacy is undeniable. The camps proved that morality and strategy were not mutually exclusive. They showed that treating the enemy with dignity could yield tangible benefits, both practical and psychological. They demonstrated that even in the darkest chapters of war, light could be found in the simplest of human gestures: a meal, a blanket, a word of respect. And as history unfolded, these lessons reverberated far beyond the Pacific War. So I ask you, listening now, when we remember World War II, we often think of battles, of generals, of weapons. But what if one of the greatest victories was not won on the battlefield at all, but within the fences of a prison camp? What if the true triumph was the decision to treat the enemy not as an object, but as a fellow human? Doesn't that challenge the way we measure greatness in history? The paradox of these Japanese prisoners reminds us that humanity can emerge in the most unexpected places. In a bowl of soup, in a doctor's care, in the sound of laughter on a baseball field. And if such humanity could survive amid the fury of global war, what excuse do we have to deny it in times of peace? The final year of the war brought new urgency, both inside and outside the camps. For the prisoners, each passing month deepened the contrast between their reality in captivity and the imagined suffering of their families back home. Rumors filtered in: Japan was starving, cities were burning, the empire was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. For men who sat down 3 times a day to balanced meals in American camps, this knowledge was both comforting and torturous. They were alive and fed, but their mothers and siblings might be hungry. Can you picture the torment of eating bread with butter while knowing your child back home might not have rice? Letters became lifelines. Prisoners poured their conflicted emotions into carefully chosen words, balancing honesty with restraint. "I am safe, I am healthy," they wrote, but behind those lines lay unspoken questions. Will you forgive me for being captured? Will you see me as a coward or as a survivor? Each envelope carried more than ink. It carried the weight of identity, honor, and hope. And when Japanese officials intercepted these letters, they faced a dilemma. Suppress them, and they admitted fear of the truth. Allow them, and they risked undermining the culture of sacrifice. Isn't it remarkable how a simple piece of mail could threaten an entire ideology? Inside the camps, routines continued. Prisoners rose at dawn, worked, studied, and played. Yet beneath the surface of ordinary life, extraordinary transformations were taking place. Men who had once been willing to throw themselves into hopeless battles now began to dream of futures. They spoke of returning home to teach, to farm, to marry. They reflected on the possibility of a life where their worth was not measured solely by their service to the emperor. Can you imagine the courage it took to let such thoughts take root, knowing they contradicted everything they had been taught? Meanwhile, American intelligence officers recognized the strategic goldmine before them. They observed how prisoners responded more readily when treated with dignity. They noted how gratitude translated into cooperation. And they realized that the humane treatment of captives was not merely a moral stance, it was a powerful tool. By respecting their humanity, they opened doors that brute force could never unlock. Isn't that an irony worth pondering? That compassion proved more effective for extracting information than cruelty ever did? For some prisoners, the camp became a place of profound self-discovery. Men who had never been asked for their opinions found themselves invited to speak in discussion groups. Those who had never owned personal belongings now had notebooks, pencils, even the occasional keepsake. One man reflected years later that he first learned to see himself as an individual in an American camp. Until then he had been a soldier, a number, a cog in a vast machine. In captivity, paradoxically, he became a person. Doesn't that seem almost unbelievable, that prison could grant what freedom had denied? Yet, not all transformations were embraced. Shame continued to haunt many. Some lived in fear of returning home, convinced they would be shunned. Others hardened themselves, refusing to be softened by kindness, clinging to the ideology of sacrifice as though it were the last tether to their past lives. These men created divisions within the camps, sometimes looking down on fellow prisoners who smiled too freely or spoke too openly with guards. They reminded each other that no matter how comfortable life might appear, they were still captives, and their duty was still to resist. In this tension, we see how deeply culture can root itself, even against the evidence of lived experience. The paradox of captivity grew sharper as news of the war's end approached. The atomic bombings, the surrender of Japan, the collapse of the empire, all these events reached the prisoners in waves, shaking them to their core. Some wept openly, mourning not only their nation's defeat but the loss of everything they had believed in. Others felt relief, even joy, at the thought of returning home. But woven through all of it was the memory of their treatment in American camps, a memory that refused to fit neatly into narratives of honor or shame. What do you think? How would you reconcile the experience of dignity in the hands of your enemy with the humiliation of your nation's collapse? When repatriation began, many prisoners faced the hardest journey of all, returning home. They boarded ships with mixed emotions, carrying stories they were unsure they could tell. Some vowed to remain silent, fearing condemnation. Others spoke cautiously, describing the camps in vague terms. A few were bold enough to say outright that they had been treated better by Americans than by their own commanders. These voices were often met with disbelief, sometimes even anger. But over time, the truth seeped into the fabric of Japanese society, carried quietly in conversations, in diaries, in memories passed down to children. Isn't it extraordinary how truth, even when silenced, finds a way to endure? The impact of these experiences rippled outward. In occupied Japan, American authorities quickly realized the value of former prisoners as bridges between cultures. They had lived with Americans, seen their values firsthand, and could testify to the reality of democracy and individual dignity. Some became advocates for reform, supporting the new constitution, promoting education, and embracing religious freedom. Others struggled in silence, caught between two worlds. Yet, whether outspoken or quiet, they carried within them the memory of a paradox, that in the heart of war they had discovered humanity. For America, too, the lessons were lasting. The success of humane prisoner policies reinforced the idea that decency and strategy could align. It proved that compassion was not weakness but strength. It shaped future approaches to international law and the treatment of captives. And it demonstrated that in the theater of global conflict, the moral high ground could yield practical advantages as well as ethical ones. Doesn't this suggest that the true power of a nation lies not only in its weapons, but in its willingness to uphold its principles? Looking back, it is tempting to see the camps as anomalies, exceptions in a war defined by brutality. But perhaps they were more than that. Perhaps they were glimpses of what humanity can be, even in its darkest hours. They remind us that the capacity for compassion is never fully extinguished, even when nations clash and ideologies collide. And they challenge us today to ask, what kind of legacy do we want our conflicts to leave? One of cruelty and vengeance, or one of dignity and respect? So as we near the end of this journey, keep in mind the young soldier we met at the beginning. Sitting on his bunk, staring at bread and soup, whispering to himself in disbelief. For him, that moment was not just about hunger satisfied. It was about a worldview shattered and remade. And for us, listening now, it is a reminder that even in the darkest of wars, humanity flickered, fragile but unbroken. When the war ended, thousands of Japanese prisoners began the long journey back across the Pacific. They boarded ships under guarded watch, but their hearts carried more than fear of the future. They carried memories, of soup steaming in tin bowls, of doctors who healed wounds without hesitation, of guards who learned their names. These were not the memories they expected to bring home from captivity. They were memories that unsettled everything they thought they knew about the enemy. Isn't it striking how the deepest transformations often come not in moments of triumph, but in moments of vulnerability? For some, the return was joyous. Families embraced them, grateful simply to have them alive. For others, it was agonizing. They faced suspicion, even scorn, accused of dishonor for surrendering rather than dying. Their stories of humane treatment were met with disbelief. How could it be true that the enemy provided food and shelter when their own nation could not? How could it be true that the enemy respected them when their own officers had not? These contradictions were painful, and many chose silence. Yet silence did not erase the truth. It lived on in their hearts, in their private journals, and in the quiet ways they raised their children differently than they themselves had been raised. Over time, these private truths began to shape public life. Some former prisoners spoke of the democracy they had glimpsed in American camps: choices, education, even religious freedom. They carried these ideas into post-war Japan, supporting reforms that emphasized individuality and human rights. Others, haunted by shame, resisted, clinging to old ideals of loyalty and sacrifice. But even they could not erase the memory of what they had experienced. It lingered, a silent reminder that another way was possible. In America, the legacy of these camps also endured. Military leaders studied the results and concluded that humane treatment was not only right but effective. They saw how dignity bred cooperation, how respect disarmed suspicion, how compassion yielded intelligence that brutality never could. These lessons influenced policies in later conflicts, shaping debates about the treatment of captives and the meaning of international law. The story of the camps became an example cited by commanders and scholars alike. Proof that decency could coexist with strength. Doesn't that challenge the cynical view that morality has no place in war? Yet the legacy is not without complexity. For every prisoner who found humanity in captivity, another found only shame. For every family that welcomed a son home, another turned him away. The paradox of American camps was not that they erased suffering, but that they revealed the cracks in a worldview built on sacrifice and silence. They forced men to confront questions they could not easily answer. Who am I if I surrendered? Who am I if my enemy treated me better than my own leaders did? These are not questions that vanish with peace treaties. They linger across lifetimes, whispered from generation to generation. And so we arrive at the heart of this story. The Japanese prisoners who called American camps paradise were not exaggerating in the sense of comfort. They were describing a revelation far deeper than food or shelter. They had discovered, perhaps for the first time, that their value as human beings did not depend on their usefulness to a machine of war. They learned that dignity could exist even in captivity, and that compassion could bloom even between enemies. That realization shook them, and it should shake us too. Because it forces us to ask, what does it mean to be human in times of conflict? And how do we measure victory, not just by battles won but by principles preserved? The lessons of those camps echo beyond the Pacific War. They remind us that the treatment of those in our power is not a reflection of their worth, but of ours. They remind us that kindness can be as strategic as it is moral. They remind us that in the darkest times, the choice to see the enemy as human is the most radical choice of all. And isn't that the kind of choice we want history to remember us for? As you reflect on this story, consider the paradox once more. Soldiers trained to fight to the death found life in captivity. Men who believed surrender was shame discovered dignity behind barbed wire. Families who expected to mourn sons lost in battle received letters instead, letters filled with words of gratitude for unexpected compassion. What do you think? Does this story change the way you see the war? Does it change the way you think about humanity itself? I invite you to share your thoughts. Would you call such a camp a prison or something else entirely? Would you see it as weakness or as strength? And if you had been that young soldier on the bunk, staring at soup and bread in disbelief, what would you have felt? Relief, confusion, shame, or perhaps a strange kind of hope? Let's talk about it. Leave a comment because your perspective adds to the living memory of this history. The war ended, but the memory remained. For the guards who carried stretchers, for the doctors who stitched wounds, for the administrators who handed out notebooks, those acts became small victories of conscience. For the prisoners who received them, those acts became lifelines. And together they wove a narrative that defied the brutality of the age. The paradise these prisoners spoke of was not a place but a principle, the principle that every person, even an enemy, carries an inalienable worth. That principle survived the war, crossed oceans, and continues to challenge us today. So let us close with this thought. The measure of a nation is not only in how it treats its allies, but in how it treats its enemies. In the American camps of World War II, that measure was tested, and found to hold. Amid the firestorms of total war, amid the destruction of cities and the collapse of empires, there flickered a light of dignity. It was fragile, imperfect, but real. And that light showed the world that even in captivity, one could still be a true human being.